Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be looking at the active and passive voice. We're going to be discussing what it is, some examples, and then the effects of using active and the effects of using passive voice. So put simply, active is when we are focusing on the subject acting, whereas passive is when we focus on the object which is being acted upon. So it's always nice to look at a simple example so that we can see the simple definitions of these two ways of constructing the sentence. So we have the boy kicks the ball and we have the ball is kicked by the boy. Now theoretically these have the exact same meaning, right? They are demonstrating the boy is kicking the ball in two different ways. So now, to understand the difference, the first sentence we can see is an active, and we can see that because the boy is the subject and the boy is doing the action to the ball, which is the object. We're starting with the subject, then we have the verb, then we have the object. Whereas in the second sentence, it's the passive voice version, we are starting with the object. The ball is kicked by the boy, and the boy is the subject, which is ending our sentence. So as you notice here, the active version of the sentence is a whole lot shorter than the passive version, and the passive version is going to include an auxiliary verb as well as the past participle of the original verb that was used in the active. And we also have the inclusion of this word by. So when we boil it down, when we convert between active and passive, we need to be aware of the following things, and these are the steps that I would say you need to follow. Firstly, you need to circle your subject and your object, and that's to help you understand firstly if your sentence is an active or passive, because if the sentence is starting with the subject, then you know it's active. If it's starting with the object, you know it's passive. But also circling the subject and the object, let's say in an active sentence, now when you want to put it into passive, you know what your object is and you know what to start your sentence with. Remember that the example I gave you was a very simple example. So when you are asked this sort of question in an exam, it's typically a sentence that is a lot longer, that has all these different parts of the sentences, all these different parts of speech going on. So go ahead and circle your subject and your object so you don't get distracted by all the extra phrases and words going on. And the next thing to remember is when you are converting between active and passive, to keep your tenses the same. So often when students convert, they might get the subject and the object placement correct, but then if it started, let's say the sentence was an active and it started in the present tense, when you go into the passive, it must still remain in the present tense. So even though you're using the past participle and the auxiliary verb, so for instance, if you have the boy kicked the ball, that is in the past tense in the active voice, therefore the auxiliary verb must also be in the past tense in the passive version. So it should be the ball was kicked by the boy. Now, a very important part of active and passive is firstly being able to convert it, and once you're able to convert it, it's important to then notice what the effect of that conversion is. So when we use active sentences, the effect of the active sentence is that it foregrounds the subject. It emphasizes the subject by making the subject the focal point. Using the active voice is also pretty direct. It gets the meaning across quite clearly, and so therefore most sentences that we read or that we speak, that we use, are going to be in the active. You'll also notice that because the active foregrounds the subject, it assigns responsibility onto the subject. The subject is seen to be responsible for the action. But we don't always use active, we sometimes use passive, and it definitely has certain benefits. So what passive does is it foregrounds the object. So if we want to emphasize the object, we're going to start with the object and therefore use the passive. The passive does tend to be wordy. We do have to add a whole bunch of different words for it to make sense. But the passive is useful when the subject is unnecessary, unimportant, or unwanted. For example, the sentence, if we say this in the active, would seem really silly if it was a sentence, the robbers robbed the bank, because it is assumed that it was robbers who robbed the bank, and we don't know who specifically the robbers are, and therefore using the subject is unnecessary. So it would make more sense to say the bank was robbed, We don't even need to include the by, we don't even need to include the subject. Also, if we want to evade blame, if we don't want to blame the subject for doing the action, we're just focusing on the action and what has been, the action has been applied to the object, then we can use the passive. So if we use the active of Tim broke the window, do you see how we are assigning blame to him? But if we didn't want to do that and we just wanted to focus on the fact that the window was broken, we could just say the window was broken, and you could say the window was broken by Tim, or just the window was broken. But either option is not assigning too much responsibility or blame onto the subject, it is focusing on the object rather. So active and passive can be asked in any part of your paper 1 in English exam, whether that's comprehension or language, but often it is used in visual literacy or in advertising. So I wanted to run through a couple of examples over here. Remember as well though that even though it's only perhaps a question asked in the paper 1 exam, you can use your active and passive and your knowledge of active and passive in your own writing when you write essays. So you know now how to foreground certain things, how to background other things. So if we look at this first example from McDonald's, this advert, it says, "You can't run from us forever." Now there's a lot to analyze with this advert in terms of its effectiveness and how it's constructed, etc. But I want to just focus on the fact that it's in the active voice. Do you see how it is foregrounding the you? It's foregrounding the consumer and making the consumer feel they have to respond to this particular advert. And so therefore we can see that the active voice has been used effectively. On the other hand, we have this other sign which says masks must be worn in the store. Do you see how that is in the passive voice? There actually is no subject present in that sentence. It is an implied subject, and therefore it still is a proper sentence. And the implied subject is obviously us, the consumer, walking into the store. But the creator of the sign has foregrounded the object of masks to make sure that that's the most important thing that gets across to you. So instead of sounding perhaps, condescending or too direct and too commanding towards the consumer, the creator of the sign has just emphasized the masks to make sure that that message has got through to the consumer in a very clear manner by using the passive voice. I hope you found that short video helpful. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you'll like the video and subscribe to the Tri-tutors channel.